Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this UK-India Business Council webinar on understanding Indian business culture, featuring Muni Trivedi from Mumbai-based communications company, Magenta. My name is Adriana Vega. I'm Policy and Research Manager at the UK-India Business Council, and I will be moderating the session. Today's session is part of our Access India webinar series, a program designed to support UK businesses through short online sessions on a variety of topics. The next webinar is going to take place on the 10th of March, and it will be covering the topic of choosing the right investment routes into India, and it will feature speakers or UK IBC members, Deloitte. The registrations for that webinar are now open, and you can find more information on the series on our website. You may also wish to look for the Access India hashtag on Twitter to join the discussions. Now, before we begin, I would like to familiarize you with the toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. Just to let you know, we will have everyone on mute during the course of the webinar to keep any background noise to a minimum. But if you have a question, you can drop it into the little bracket on the toolbox to your right in the Please Type Your Question Here box to send me your question, and then I will take it up during the Q&A session at the end. For now, just to make sure that you can all hear me clearly, could I please ask that you all use the Raise Your Hand button on the toolbar? Again, it's on the right-hand side. If you can use the Raise Your Hand button on the toolbar. Yes, that's great. Okay, thank you. I would now like to welcome Muni Trivedi, who is Director at Magenta, and she's going to share her insights into India's business culture. Over to you, Muni.
Thanks, Adri. So, what do you need to do to win in India? Clearly, given its size and potential, India matters economically. How can you navigate the nuances and conquer the chaos to capture your piece of the pakora? By making the time to join this webinar today, I assume you know some of the headline facts: the 1.2 billion population, world's biggest democracy, huge potential middle-class market, and so on. Today, I'd like to explore some of the other lesser-known facts and commonly held myths about the country that has been my home for the last 6 years. I moved from London in early 2009 to set up a business based in Mumbai. I'd like to share some of my first-hand experience. What is it about India and Indians that make it such a unique and fascinating place that offers up great opportunities to those willing to make the effort and have the fortitude to stick it out? There are 3 parts to my presentation: some lesser-known facts that illustrate why India is important, the reality. Drawing on my personal experience and insights gathered over 6 years, I'll discuss some of the cultural complexities. And finally, we'll look at the implications for those seeking to do business in India, the strategies and considerations needed to succeed in this challenging environment. So, why is India important? I thought I'd start by sharing some interesting India facts. Since independence, India has built 1.25 million miles of new roads. It's raised steel output 50 times and cement production 20 times. It's now the 2nd largest cycle producer. So if you're thinking of bringing puncture repair kits here, you could be onto a winner. India churns out more films than anywhere else. According to Forbes, last year, Bollywood produced more than 1,600 films, almost 4 times that produced in Hollywood. It boasts the best delivery boys, the Dabbawalas, with an efficiency rating of 99.9999%. That's good in anyone's books, and a case study at Harvard Business School. At 129 million tons, India is the world's #1 milk producer, but has to import skim milk in the summer to meet demand. India recycles 60% of its plastic waste. Japan and China lag behind at 12% and 10% respectively. It's the 7th largest country by area and 2nd largest by population, that speaks between them more than 120 official languages. Indian Railways has the largest workforce in the world, employing 1.55 million people, carrying more than 13 million passengers every day. The rapidly growing middle class is aspirational, with rising incomes driving demand for a host of infrastructure, products and services. The opportunities are huge, so let's take a look at what you need to do to best position yourself. So let's take a look at the on-the-ground reality in India and its culture. There are many stereotypes that abound when people talk about India and doing business either in the country or with Indian companies. I'd like to explore some of the things that make India such a challenging while at the same time exciting opportunity. I'll talk about some of these stereotypes and deconstruct some of the myths. India is a land of extremes. The sheer numbers, the climate, the disparities of wealth, the fact that goddesses are revered yet mortal women are subjected to a host of discrimination. Indians are adept at living with complexity and managing ambiguity. In this section, I look at some of the complexity and why it is how it is. We look at corporate and interpersonal culture, the female dynamic, language, religion, and regional diversity. My area of professional practice is communications, and culture plays a huge part in how people and companies communicate. It's much more than knowing when to shake hands or join them in salutation and say namaste. Culture manifests itself in the ways individuals interact and the way in which corporations go about their business. So let's start with corporate culture. Harvard Business School's Professor Rohit Deshpande describes 4 basic types of company. So I'll just take a minute to explain them. Clans. These foster consensus and cohesiveness and are family-oriented. They love meetings and the leader is seen as a mentor. Adhocracies. Very entrepreneurial and creative, where less meetings happen and weird stuff is rewarded. The leader is often a risk taker. Hierarchies. They plan and do everything by the book. They like structure and are typical of older organizations with an emphasis on predictability. And finally, competitors. They just want to be number one in their field, and the leader is goal-oriented and decisive. All companies will have some of these attributes, but some traits dominate. And think of your organization and see where you fit. So what traits do successful companies portray? It's the innovators. These are entrepreneurial, open organizations that encourage employee participation. They are customer-focused, not internally focused, and they are what Deshpande called the competitor adhocracy cultures, the stars. And the interesting thing is that these types of companies are successful regardless of territory. If you've spent time with Indian companies, you'll realize that competitor or adhocracies aren't the dominant forms of enterprise. India has a predominance of what are known colloquially as promoter-owned companies, what in the West would be described as a family business. Most of Indian industry is in the hands of around 14 essentially family businesses. Indian companies tend to be extremely hierarchical. Corporate structures have many more layers than we're used to dealing with in flatter Western companies. Everyone has and knows their place, and subordinates are extremely deferential to those above. I'd like to consider the work of one other business thinker who wrote about culture. Geert Hofstede compared national cultures using measures that he termed power distance, long-term orientation, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, individuality, and indulgence. The traits he described are helpful when it comes to understanding India and its business culture, and I'm going to just look at a few of them in a bit more detail. So let's start with power distance. This is essentially a measure of social inequality. India's power distance index is a high at 77 versus a world average of 56.5, and the UK scores 35. Respect is based on age and professional seniority rather than proficiency. People tend to be addressed by their title, or at least as sir or ma'am. It's common to see someone's university qualifications on their business card. A high power distance like India's reflects a highly hierarchical society with huge inequalities of power and wealth. Power distance not only shows the levels of disparity, it also signals the degree to which a society seems to accept it as the norm. In India, huge gaps exist between rich and poor, powerful and downtrodden, and this is broadly seen as acceptable, or at least just as the way things are. Pictured here is the beautiful Four Seasons Hotel in Mumbai, and right next to it is a huge slum. The second measure is long-term orientation. India's long-term orientation is ranked at 61, where the world average is 48. The UK ranks at 51. This is a measure of the degree to which people, and by extension companies, live for today, low long-term orientation, or plan for tomorrow and defer gratification, high long-term orientation. Thrift, saving, and excelling in education are encouraged as ways to prepare for the future. The Hindu belief in karma is another manifestation of this long-term orientation. A senior HR professional in a large Indian conglomerate once told me about the difficulty of introducing a performance management system. She placed this in the context of a predominantly Hindu workforce which believes in reincarnation. How do you manage performance in a situation where people take a very fatalistic attitude? They think along the lines of, well, if it doesn't happen in this life, maybe in the next. It's an interesting insight into how cultural differences have unexpected impacts on business life, both this one and the next. Another dimension that is often used to compare cultures is that of masculinity. India's ranks at 56 compared to the world average of 51. And interestingly, the UK score is 66, that is much more masculine than the average. Here, higher scores relate to a society where competition, achievement and success are seen as commendable, where men are generally held in higher regard than women. Examples in India are the birth of a baby boy, more celebrated than that of a girl, and the sad truth that is female feticide. Female education at 65% versus 82% for males leads to lower female literacy and consequently India's soaring birth rates. The image shows one girl in the midst of many boys. The reality both reflects and contradicts this. In my own experience, I've been in meetings with potential suppliers where I was asking some quite technical questions and answers were directed to my male and less knowledgeable colleague. Even now, I could say the same thing as my taller, white, male business partner, and he will be heard and deferred to while I am left feeling invisible. Furthermore, being outwardly Indian, there are unspoken expectations of me that my white male partner is happily excused of or conversely applauded for. He obviously finds this much easier to cope with than I, who often have to rely on my sense of humour here. So while the mother, sister, wife is revered almost as a goddess, other women are simply disregarded. Women are validated through their relationships rather than as people in their own right. And there are still instances where a woman will require her husband's signature, such as an application for a bank account. Increasingly, women are turning the tide and succeeding as business leaders. While women hold just 10.7% of seats in the Indian Parliament, other sectors are healthier. In banking and finance, the heads of India's leading private bank ICICI Bank and HSBC India, the National Stock Exchange and Capgemini are women. In food and pharma, for companies such as Britannia Industry and Piramal, in law, AZB, and your favourite and mine, Facebook, all headed up by women. No longer are women only given the token place on the board, heading up the traditionally nurturing CSR remit. More so, they are heading the whole business and doing a great job. So finally, I'd like to look briefly at what Hofstede called uncertainty avoidance. Indians relish uncertainty. Rather than avoid it, they welcome it. Managing complexity and ambiguity comes as second nature. India's lowest ranking is for uncertainty avoidance at 40 versus a world average of 65, and the UK ranks at 35. There is something of an irony when you consider the burdensome levels of bureaucracy that exist. Rather, it shows how Indians accept imperfection and find ways around a perceived impediment. So let's move on to language. Another important dimension of culture is language, and much is spoken about India's large population of English speakers. Actually, the idea of English as a common language is a misnomer. A tiny 0.02% of Indians, that's around 230,000 people, have English as a first language. A staggering 125 million speak it as a second or third language. That's twice as many as the population of the UK. Education First rates India's proficiency in English as moderate, ranking it at 25th out of 63 countries where English is not the mother tongue. In many ways, English has become the bridge language that allows, say, a native Bengali to communicate with a Gujarati speaker. Neither has a great time to deal with the linguistic nuances. One of the things we've struggled with is finding Indians who can write good business English without a host of Indianisms. Indian English tends to be somewhat Edwardian, rather showy and unnecessarily complex. It contains commonly used words and phrases that, while they're correct, sound odd to the native English ear. For example, things in India happen once, twice, and thrice. And when Indians have a question about something, they have a doubt. When they go away, they are out of station. And actually, they don't just go, as that means they're going to die. Rather, they go and come back. And on that subject, whereas in the rest of the world people die, Indians, it seems, expire or turn off. Being in the business of corporate communications, one of our mantras is less is more, or the KISS principle of keep it simple, stupid. We find this principle, regularly used as best practice elsewhere, is at odds with Indian thinking. Indian business people's writing style tends to be more long-winded than what we are accustomed to in the West. Short sentences are rare. In many ways, it can be a colourful writing style. When you read a newspaper headline, a miscreant has been nabbed, it does paint a certain dramatic picture. So, let's move on to religion. Despite being a secular state, religion permeates almost every aspect of Indian life. 81% of the population is Hindu, and Hinduism contains hundreds of deities with holidays to match. Here's a scene from the annual Ganesh festival that brings cities across Western India to a standstill each September. Allied to various religious beliefs are a host of dietary choices. Probably half of India is vegetarian. Muslims and Christians are typically meat-eating or non-vegetarian, as it's called. My children were worried that some of their strictly vegetarian classmates would object to the non-vegetarian boiled eggs I packed in their tiffin lunch boxes this morning. The complexities start very young here. Although broadly a tolerant democratic society, there are instances where intolerance abounds. Apartment blocks openly display signs saying only Gujarati vegetarians may live here, and Catholic colonies where you'd need a letter from a priest vouching for your regular attendance at church to become resident. It's the kind of discrimination that's long been outlawed in the West and will continue to outrage any Guardian reader. So, to the last part of this section, regional diversity. Textbook India deals with a nation of 1.2 billion people as a single market. As such, it cannot be homogeneous. It's a rich, complex place. It has more than 120 official languages. There isn't one India, and so developing an India strategy requires a much more detailed understanding of where and with whom you might be doing business. Tata Salt is a great indigenous example of this kind of localized marketing. A leading brand of one of India's largest and best-known companies recognizes India's diverse identities and markets to them accordingly, often in the local language. In many ways, it makes sense to think of India in the way one would think of Europe or Africa. You wouldn't have a single European strategy, and the same is true of India. So let's then look at what impact these on-the-ground realities have as you develop your India strategy. In part 3, we look at what the implications are for doing business with India. Experiential learning. We talked about some of the cultural factors that give rise to complexity and ambiguity and slow decision-making that characterize India. Building a business in India is a long-term proposition. Be prepared to be on the ground and to invest. In my experience, nothing beats first-hand knowledge. Practical challenges such as setting up a bank account and getting registered for tax are one side of the story, but learning to circumvent protracted decision-making, which has real implications and costs for my business, and drawing on my inner goddess to cope with gender bias I wouldn't have encountered in the West, have taught me much about myself. I talked about regional variations. If we think back to the type of company that wins regardless of territory, it's the competitor adhocracy corporate culture that is most open and innovative that will succeed. It's the one that empowers and trusts its staff or local subsidiaries. It adapts itself to the needs of its environment, and it's the one that is outward-facing rather than inwardly focused that will be the winner. Some examples of great localized marketing are McDonald's and Pizza Hut, who have both tailored their offerings to vegetarian-only restaurants. JCB and Dow Chemical have adapted their product ranges to offer India-centric solutions and management structures. There is an interesting read by Rama Bijapurkar which talks about Indianness and the Indian consumer, the title of which is "We Are Like That Only." I think that in order to succeed, an understanding of why things are as they are is essential. I think it's actually much less a case of "we are like that only," more it's "we are like that because of a lot of cultural factors only." And someone once explained to me the acronym India as "I'll never do it again." For some, it is too challenging, too complex, culturally a very long way from their points of reference. Don't let that be your experience. It is exciting and challenging, but with the right preparation and an open mind, it offers immense potential. I hope that gives you some fresh perspective, and I'll be pleased to answer some questions. So let me leave with you with a picture of Holi, the festival of colour that happens this Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Moni, for that very interesting presentation. That was very useful, and I'm sure it was very helpful for our attendees today. I will now try to go through some of the questions that have been submitted. Again, I just wanted to invite our attendees. They can submit their questions in the little box on your right-hand side of your screen. For now, Moni, I just wanted to ask you, in regards to the hierarchical point that you made earlier, about business people in India using, for example, their university titles and their business cards. What is your opinion? Is it expected of foreigners as well to observe this kind of practice, or what would you recommend for someone going to India on, say, a business trip? Should they have bespoke business cards, for instance? What's your advice?
No, I think you should not sort of prejudge or pre-think that, oh, it'll be like that. I think you'd be aware that, you know, in the UK, for instance, things are much less formal and you could hug someone that you've met before. Whereas in India, you would probably still be quite formal. And even if you're on first names with your boss, you would still be you know, it would still be formal. There is a business card culture, and you would hand a business card over often with two hands rather than just your right hand. So keep lots and lots of cards with you, even at social occasions. You know, it'll be the norm to hand cards over. But I think rather than, you know, expecting some perceived difference, just be yourself. People won't expect you to know all the nuances and all the peculiarities that go with doing business in India, but just, you know, be yourself, have lots of business cards and enjoy the experience, learn from the differences. I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you. Another question for you is, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you have seen or heard about foreigners making when they come to India? Like, what are the big no-nos that you have seen through the years that you've been working there?
I think, as one of the points I made, was that India is a long-term investment. When we've run businesses or started businesses in the West, we were looking at about a 3 to 5 year time scale. You know, as a business person, you're always working out your exit strategy. India is a much longer proposition. You know, it goes back to the long-term orientation. You know, often you see people coming in and out every couple of weeks, you know, or every 6 weeks or so. They fly in, have a couple of meetings, go back to their nice Bayswater apartment. You've got to be here. You've got to be on the ground. Things happen at very short notice, which took me a long time to get used to. You know, yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. And you can only do that if you're on the ground here. The decision-making takes much longer, where in meetings, you know, they tend to be a forum for discussion rather than actual points being agreed that this will be the next action point, we will do this. It's much more, okay, I'll go away and think about that. And then decision-making, because of the hierarchies and the much more, there are more layers in an Indian organization than we'd be used to in the West. So decision-making still tends to be centralized around 1 or 2 key people, but there are a lot more people involved in passing that through and gatekeepers. So that all takes much longer, so you will have to be much more patient than you would have had to be in the West.
Great. There's another question, and this one is in regard to bribes and facilitation payments. So if you were to train your Indian partner or your Indian workforce on, you know, practices in the West and how perhaps this is not acceptable, then what would be your approach so that, you know, there's in a way covering all your bases, and at the same time, you know, is this common practice in India, or can you comment on this point?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal perspective, you know, from a business perspective, we haven't really encountered it, but it does happen. I think a lot of it is driven by the industry that you're in. So something like construction is much more prone to inducements. And there's a difference between bribes, where you're paying for something that shouldn't be done, and speed money, where you're paying for something that should be done, but without sort of greasing a palm, it's just not going to happen in any reasonable time. And that then means that there's a lot of middlemen and agents involved. So there's low-level corruption, if you like, where, you know, it's your word against the policeman who stopped you for potentially going through a red light. And there's the other side where you've got contracts that may or may not be signed. What I would say is the UK and the US have brought in very strict anti-corruption laws where if your company is registered in the UK or the US and you get caught, as part of some kind of, you get caught with your hand in the till, shall we say, you can be prosecuted anywhere. It's some of the strictest anti-bribery, anti-corruption laws anywhere in the world. It could be thought that the UK is maybe slightly less competitive. I think it's actually a good thing that, and it leads to transparency. The other thing I would say is take good legal advice. Don't be afraid to pay for someone to tell you exactly how it is. There are really good law firms here that understand cross-border business, and so use their knowledge, and they're on the ground here, and if you intend to spend time here, you will need that in-depth knowledge.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful, actually. And finally, one last question. There's one of our attendees wanted to know about the differences, culturally speaking, of doing business in the big metros, say Mumbai, Delhi, versus the more tier 2 cities and even rural areas. So could you comment on that, please?
So, I mean, the big focus is on the big tier 1 cities, if you like, Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, Ahmedabad. But there are a whole host of what are called tier 2 cities that are fast growing, where it's economically, if you're setting up a manufacturing site, certain areas give it's beneficial to go into a tier 2 city. Staff could be, will be just as adaptable, but could be more cost effective, shall we say. There may be some differences in attitude. Being in Bombay or Delhi, it might be easier for an inbound company to settle quicker because it has that slightly more international world view. But there's nothing stopping you to try a greenfield or brownfield site. And, fortune favors the brave, I think.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Muni, very much for today. I hope that this session was useful for our attendees. If any of our attendees today, if you have any feedback or comments about today's session or any session that you'd like to see us do in the future, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks again, Muni, and for everyone else, please feel free to check our website. There's a number of webinars coming up, as you can see on your screens right now, and they're open for registration. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.